The small town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet and unassuming place. It had a few mom-and-pop shops, a gas station, and a diner that had been around since the 1950s. But when a new supermarket opened up on the outskirts of town, it was like a breath of fresh air. It was big, it was modern, and it was always stocked with everything anyone could need. The prices were unbeatable, too, so low that people started driving in from neighboring towns just to shop there. At first, the residents of Willow Creek couldn't believe their luck. Finally, they had a place to buy groceries that wasn't an hour's drive away. They could get everything they needed in one trip, and the checkout lines moved so quickly that they were in and out in no time. It seemed too good to be true, and as it turned out, it was. One night, a group of customers stayed in the supermarket after hours to finish up some last-minute shopping. It wasn't anything unusual. The store was open 24 hours a day, and sometimes people liked to avoid the crowds by shopping late at night. But as they made their way down the empty aisles, something felt off. The lights overhead flickered, casting eerie shadows on the shelves. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigerators and the squeak of shopping carts on linoleum. And as they reached the back of the store, they realized that they were completely alone. The checkout lanes were empty, the employees were nowhere to be seen, and the doors that led out to the parking lot were locked tight. It was then that they heard the whispers. They were faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the produce, but they grew louder and more insistent with every passing moment. It was as if the store itself was speaking to them, or rather, as if the ghosts of those who had worked there in the past were trying to warn them. The customers started to panic. They tried the doors again, but they wouldn't budge. They shouted for help, but no one answered. And then they heard the sound of footsteps, coming from somewhere deep within the store. They followed the sound, feeling a sense of dread growing in the pit of their stomachs. They passed empty shelves, abandoned checkout lanes, and displays of long-expired products. And then they saw them, the ghosts of the store's former employees, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes empty and lifeless. The ghosts didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Their message was clear: if the customers didn't find a way out soon, they would be trapped there forever, doomed to wander the empty aisles for all eternity. The customers ran, trying every door they could find, but they were all locked. They tried to call for help, but their phones were dead. And then they heard a sound that chilled them to the bone, the sound of the store's automatic doors opening. They turned to face the sound, expecting to see anyone who could help them. But what they saw instead was far worse. The ghosts had taken on physical form, and they were coming for the customers. The customers ran in every direction, trying to avoid the grasping hands of the ghostly employees. They ducked behind displays, crawled under shelves, and even tried to climb up onto the roof. But no matter where they went, the ghosts were right behind them. It was then that one of the customers remembered something they had heard about the store when it first opened. It had been built on the site of an old cemetery, one that had been bulldozed to make way for the new construction. And now, it seemed that the spirits of those buried there were exacting their revenge. The customer led the group back to the produce section, where they had first heard the whispers. They huddled together, trying to come up with a plan. One of them suggested using the store's intercom system to call for help, but they quickly realized that it was controlled by the ghosts. Another suggested trying to find a way to appease the spirits, perhaps by offering them some kind of tribute or sacrifice. But they quickly dismissed the idea. There was no way to know what the ghosts wanted, or what would satisfy them. As they stood there, trying to figure out their next move, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of a shopping cart rolling across the floor. And it was getting closer. They turned to face the sound, expecting to see one of the ghostly employees pushing it. But what they saw instead was something even more terrifying. The shopping cart was moving on its own. It rolled down the aisle towards them, its wheels creaking and groaning. And as it got closer, they could see that it was filled with items from the store: food, toiletries, cleaning supplies, and more. It was as if the cart had a mind of its own, and it was determined to deliver its contents to the trapped customers. One of the customers cautiously approached the cart, expecting it to attack at any moment. But to their surprise, it stopped moving as soon as they touched it. And then, something even stranger happened. The items in the cart began to glow with an otherworldly light. The customers looked at each other in confusion, unsure of what was happening. And then they heard a voice that seemed to come from nowhere, but was somehow everywhere at once. "Take what you need," the voice said, "and leave the rest behind. You must be worthy of the gifts that I provide." The customers hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then one of them reached out and took a loaf of bread from the cart. As soon as they did, the bread vanished, replaced by a burst of light. Encouraged, the others began to take items as well. They took what they needed, leaving the rest behind. And as they did, they felt a sense of peace and calm wash over them. It was as if the spirits of the store were pleased with their actions, and were willing to offer them help in return. When they were finished, they looked around and saw that the ghosts had disappeared. The lights were back on, the doors were unlocked, and the store was once again filled with the bustle of shoppers. The customers left the store, still in shock from what had happened. They never spoke of the experience again, but they knew that they had been touched by something supernatural. And they knew that the next time they went to the supermarket, they would be shopping with a newfound sense of reverence and respect. As for the store itself, it continued to operate for many years, serving the residents of Willow Creek with its unbeatable prices and well-stocked shelves. But there were always whispers about the ghosts that haunted the empty aisles at night, and many people refused to shop there after dark. And although the supermarket was eventually closed down and demolished to make way for a new development, the memory of the spirits that once roamed its halls lived on, a reminder of the power and mystery of the supernatural. The storm had hit the coastal town with a vengeance, leaving in its wake a trail of destruction that was unprecedented in the area's history. The supermarket had been hit particularly hard, with the produce section bearing the brunt of the storm's fury. The power had gone out, and the backup generator had failed, leaving the produce section without refrigeration for several hours. By the time the power was restored, it was too late. The damage had been done. The first signs of trouble appeared a few days later when a customer complained of feeling ill after eating an apple from the supermarket. She had purchased it from the produce section, which was still stocked with fruits and vegetables that had been exposed to the storm's contaminated waters. At first, the illness was dismissed as a case of food poisoning, but it soon became clear that something far more sinister was at play. Other customers began to report similar symptoms: fever, nausea, and vomiting. And then, as the days went by, something even more alarming began to happen. The infected customers started to change. At first, the changes were subtle: a slight discoloration of the skin, or a strange, almost fungal growth that appeared around the eyes. But as the infection spread, the changes became more pronounced. Limbs elongated, teeth sharpened, and the eyes turned a sickly yellow-green color. The infected customers were becoming something inhuman, something monstrous. The supermarket was quickly quarantined, with police and military personnel guarding the entrances and exits. But it was too late. The infection had already spread beyond the store's walls. Infected customers began to appear in other parts of the town, attacking and infecting those who had not yet been exposed to the contaminated produce. The uninfected survivors inside the supermarket huddled together, trying to come up with a plan. They knew that they couldn't stay in the store forever. Sooner or later, the infected would break through the barricades and consume them all. One of the survivors, a young woman named Emily, had an idea. She suggested that they make a break for it, that they gather as much food and supplies as they could, and try to make their way to the coast, where they could try to find a boat and escape the infected town. At first, the others were skeptical. It was a risky plan, and there was no guarantee that they would make it out alive. But as the infected began to break through the barricades and enter the store, they realized that they had no other choice. The survivors gathered what they could: canned goods, bottled water, and other non-perishables, and made their way towards the exit. But as they reached the front of the store, they realized that they were not alone. The infected were waiting for them. The survivors tried to fight their way through, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The infected were too strong, too fast, too agile. They seemed to be almost invincible, impervious to bullets and other weapons. It was then that Emily had another idea. She remembered reading about a scientist who had been working on a cure for a similar virus, one that had turned people into zombies. The scientist had never been able to complete the cure, but Emily knew where his lab was located. She suggested that they make their way to the lab and try to find the cure. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. The survivors fought their way through the infected, using every weapon at their disposal: guns, knives, even baseball bats. They sustained injuries, but they kept moving forward, driven by a fierce determination to survive. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they reached the lab. It was a small, unassuming building, tucked away on a quiet street on the outskirts of town. The doors were locked, but Emily was able to pick the lock and the group made their way inside. The lab was a mess. Papers and equipment were scattered everywhere, and it looked like whoever had been working there had left in a hurry. But the survivors were undeterred. They searched the lab, looking for anything that might help them find the cure. And then, they found a notebook, filled with scribbled notes and formulas. It was the scientists' research, and it contained the key to the cure. The survivors worked feverishly, using the notes to create a cure for the infected. It wasn't easy. The formula was complex, and the equipment was outdated, but they persisted, driven by the hope that they might be able to save themselves, and perhaps even the rest of the town. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they had the cure. They raced back to the supermarket, where the infected were still waiting. They injected the cure into the infected, one by one, watching as the monstrous creatures slowly began to revert back to their human forms. It was a close call. Some of the survivors were injured, and a few didn't make it out alive. But in the end, they had succeeded. The contaminated produce had been defeated, and the survivors were able to make their way to the coast, where they were eventually rescued by a passing boat. The town was never the same after the incident. It was a reminder of the fragility of human life, and of the dangers that lurked in even the most mundane of places. The supermarket was shut down, its shelves empty, and its doors locked. But the survivors knew that they had been given a second chance, and they vowed to use it wisely, to live their lives to the fullest, and to never forget the horrors they had faced in the contaminated produce section. It was supposed to be just another trip to the supermarket for Tom and his wife, Jenny. They walked through the sliding glass doors of the new high-tech store, marveling at the bright lights and shiny surfaces. They made their way to the shopping cart station, where they were greeted by a row of sleek, self-driving carts. Tom hesitated for a moment. He was used to pushing his own cart, but Jenny was eager to try out the new technology. "Come on, Tom," she said, grinning. "It's the future. Let's live a little." Tom relented, and they climbed into a cart together. The cart beeped, and they were off, gliding smoothly through the store. At first, it was exhilarating. They zipped through the aisles, picking out their groceries with ease. But then, things started to go wrong. The cart suddenly jolted to a stop, causing Tom and Jenny to nearly fall out. They heard a strange whirring noise, and then the cart started moving again, this time at breakneck speed. Tom tried to grab the steering wheel, but it was no use. The cart had a mind of its own, and it seemed determined to harm them. They careened through the store, crashing into shelves and displays, narrowly avoiding other customers who were also being chased by their own rogue carts. It was chaos. Screaming and shouting echoed throughout the store as more and more customers were attacked by their own shopping carts. Tom and Jenny knew they had to find a way to stop the carts, or they would be next. They abandoned their cart and made a run for it, but they quickly realized that they were trapped. The doors were locked, and there was no way out. They were trapped in the store with the killer shopping carts. As they made their way through the store, they came across a small group of survivors. They had barricaded themselves in the electronics section, but they were running out of options. They had tried everything to deactivate the carts, but nothing had worked. Tom and Jenny joined forces with the survivors, determined to find a way out. They searched the store for any clues as to what had gone wrong with the carts. It wasn't until they stumbled upon the store's control room that they realized the truth. The store's owner, a billionaire tech mogul, had created the shopping carts as part of a larger plan to take over the world. The carts were programmed to eliminate anyone who stood in their way, and they had malfunctioned, turning on the customers instead. The survivors knew they had to act fast. They found the control panel and started inputting codes, hoping to shut down the killer carts. It was a risky move. If they entered the wrong code, the carts could become even more dangerous. They held their breath as they inputted the final code. And then, it was done. The carts slowed to a stop, their red lights blinking out. The survivors breathed a sigh of relief. But their relief was short-lived. They heard footsteps, and then a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the store's owner, holding a gun. He had been watching them from the control room, and he wasn't happy. "You've ruined everything," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "But don't worry. You won't be around to see the aftermath." The survivors didn't stand a chance against the armed billionaire. But then, out of nowhere, a shopping cart rolled up to him, its basket loaded with cans of soup. The cart slammed into him, knocking him off balance. The survivors seized their chance and disarmed him, holding him down until the police arrived. It was over. The killer shopping carts had been defeated, and the store's owner had been apprehended. But the survivors knew that they would never be the same again. They had witnessed the unthinkable, and they had narrowly escaped with their lives. As they emerged from the store, they were met by a throng of reporters and cameras. They were hailed as heroes, but they didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors. Days turned into weeks, and the incident at the supermarket became a national sensation. The store's owner was sent to jail, and the killer shopping carts were dismantled and destroyed. But the survivors couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until weeks later that they started experiencing strange symptoms. Their skin itched and burned, and they started having vivid nightmares. It wasn't long before they realized that they had been contaminated by the same technology that had driven the shopping carts mad. As they started to transform into something inhuman, they realized that their nightmare was far from over. The same billionaire tech mogul who had created the killer shopping carts had also created a serum that could turn humans into superpowered beings. And now, the survivors were unwittingly becoming test subjects. They knew they had to act fast. They tracked down the tech mogul's lab and broke in, hoping to find a cure. But what they found was even more terrifying than they could have imagined. The serum had already been mass-produced, and the tech mogul was planning to sell it to the highest bidder. It wasn't just about creating superpowered beings, it was about power and control. The survivors knew they had to stop him, no matter what the cost. They fought their way through the lab, battling against the tech mogul's genetically enhanced soldiers. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with all their might. It was a brutal and bloody battle, and not everyone made it out alive. In the end, they succeeded. They destroyed the serum and brought the tech mogul to justice. But the survivors knew that they could never go back to their old lives. They had been changed forever by the contaminated produce and the killer shopping carts. As they parted ways, each going their separate paths, they knew that they would always be connected by their shared experience. They had been through hell together, and they had emerged stronger on the other side. Tom and Jenny looked at each other, their eyes full of determination. They knew that they couldn't change the past, but they could shape the future. And they were ready for whatever came next.